Imagine it's 1935.
Okay.
You're standing at the absolute bottom of the Grand Canyon.
Hmm?
You're baking in literally 110-degree heat.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah, and you're just swinging a pickaxe into solid rock.
Uh-huh.
And you're a U.S. citizen laboring under this blazing sun to build a trail for a national park that, people are going to use for generations.
Right.
You're sweating, you're totally exhausted, and you are undeniably contributing to the physical infrastructure of the country. And this is the crazy part, if someone goes to Washington, D.C., walks into the Federal Archives, and opens the official government ledgers to find your name, you just don't exist.
You're just a ghost on paper.
Exactly. Your labor is right there in the stone. But on paper, your identity has been completely scrubbed. So today we're taking a deep dive into how the most popular government program in U.S. history used paperwork to make thousands of men vanish.
It really is the fundamental paradox of the archive, isn't it? I mean, we tend to think of historical records as neutral, like they're objective reflections of reality.
Like a ledger is just math.
Right, exactly. But the dossier of sources we're examining today, it completely forces us to look at the archive not as a mirror, but as a highly curated, almost artificial space.
Yeah.
We're investigating the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, specifically from 1933 to 1942, and we are looking for the men who fell, well, completely outside the established administrative lines.
The people the system didn't know what to do with.
Exactly. The Hispanic and Mexican-American enrollees of the Southwest who were classified as neither black nor white, and also the men who served in the territorial camps. So Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, and the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think for you listening, we really need to set the scale here. The CCC was massive.
Huge.
People called it the Forest Army. Over its 9-year run, it employed roughly 3 million men.
3 million.
3 million. I mean, if you've ever hiked a trail in a state park, or maybe camped in a national forest, or even climbed one of those fair observation towers, there is a very, very high probability you are interacting with CCC infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
And the popular narrative of this program is almost universally glowing, right? It's the classic story of idle, desperate urban youth going out into the woods, getting 3 square meals a day and, sending money home to starving families while building the American outdoors.
Which is true, but it's incomplete.
Right. Because our dossier today is asking a really pointed, uncomfortable question. Who did the CCC's paperwork refuse to count?
And understanding that refusal is just essential for anyone studying history because it fundamentally changes how you consume information.
Oh, so?
Well, reading history isn't just about, absorbing the text printed on the page. It requires learning how to read the gaps, the margins, the silences.
Looking for what's not there.
Right. When we ask who was standing there doing the heavy lifting when the bureaucrat with the pen decided to just look away, we're looking at the mechanics of statistical erasure.
Statistical erasure. I like that phrase.
Yeah, it's about examining how administrative policies, sometimes through malice, and sometimes just through sheer bureaucratic inertia, intentionally create systemic barriers and demographic vacuums.
Right, because if the government doesn't count you, it means they don't have to accommodate you.
Exactly.
They don't have to promote you or even really acknowledge your civil rights within their system.
Precisely.
So before we can get into the woods or down into the canyon or across the ocean to Hawaii, we have to start at the very first barrier. The structural hurdle of who was even allowed to walk through the front door of a CCC recruitment office.
And that initial filter was citizenship. And the legislative history of how that filter was established is just incredibly telling.
Okay, let's get into the Emergency Conservation Work Act.
Right, so the CCC was created by this act, which was passed with lightning speed and signed on March 31st, 1933. And woven right into the DNA of that legislation is a profound contradiction about who gets to participate in federal relief.
Well, let's talk about the anti-discrimination clause first.
Right.
Because on its face, reading it today, it sounds incredibly progressive for 1933.
Yeah.
This was the work of Congressman Oscar DePriest, right?
Yes, Oscar DePriest. He was a Republican from Illinois, and crucially, he was the only black member of Congress at that time.
The only one? Wow.
The only one. And he recognized the massive danger of a federal relief program being administered locally, especially in the Jim Crow South. If there were no federal safeguards, he knew exactly how that money would be distributed.
Right. It just wouldn't go to black families.
Exactly. So he fought tenaciously to attach an amendment to the bill, ensuring that no discrimination could occur on account of race, color, or creed.
which is amazing.
It was a monumental legislative victory to get that into a New Deal program in 1933.
So you have this explicit federal mandate, no discrimination based on race. It sounds
Yeah.
like an open door.
It does.
But then you look at the fine print of the exact same law, and it simultaneously restricts eligibility exclusively to U.S. citizens.
Yeah.
Why the contradiction? I mean, why throw a massive, seemingly open casting call, advertising no discrimination, but then put a hidden VIP list at the door?
Well, the contradiction is really born from the severe economic anxiety of the Great Depression. The logic of the era dictated that scarce federal relief dollars could only go to, quote-unquote, authentic Americans.
Right. Protect your own first.
Exactly. So while DePriest secured protection for native-born Black Americans, the citizenship requirement functioned as a quiet, devastating filter against immigrants.
Because it didn't explicitly say, no immigrants from this specific country.
Right. It wasn't a loud, overtly racial ban in its language, which is allowed it to pass without technically violating DePriest's anti-discrimination clause. But its functional on-the-ground result was a massive exclusion based on national origin.
I really want to ground this in what was actually happening in the country in 1933, because the timing of the citizenship requirement is just brutal, particularly in the Southwest. We're just coming out of the Hoover administration. Can you explain the Hoover-era repatriation drives?
Oh, yes. This is essential context. So during the early years of the Depression, local and federal authorities engaged in these aggressive, coordinated campaigns to remove people of Mexican descent from the United States.
And they called them repatriation drives, right?
Yeah.
Which sounds almost voluntary.
It sounds totally bureaucratic and voluntary, yeah. But in practice, they were forced deportations fueled entirely by economic scapegoating. Authorities would literally raid public spaces. Like they would sweep the plaza in Los Angeles, just demanding documentation from anyone who looked Mexican.
Just stopping people on the street.
Exactly. And the absolute terror of these campaigns is that they frequently swept up U.S. citizens of Mexican descent, people born in Texas, California, New Mexico.
Wait, so you could be born in Los Angeles but get deported in Mexico?
Yes, deported alongside Mexican nationals simply because they couldn't instantly produce a birth certificate on the street when asked.
That is horrifying.
It was a climate of intense terror.
So the CCC opens its doors right in the middle of this environment. You have Mexican immigrant men who have been living and working in the U.S. for decades. Maybe they've raised entirely U.S.-born families here, and they are completely shut out of this life-saving federal relief program because of that single line requiring citizenship.
They were entirely barred. And for another demographic, Asian immigrants, the legal trap was actually even more absolute.
How so?
Well, our dossier points out that Asian immigrants weren't just unnaturalized. Under the incredibly racist naturalization laws of the era, dating all the way back to the Page Act and the Asian Exclusion Act, they were legally classified as aliens ineligible to citizenship.
Wait, let me make sure I understand that. It wasn't just that they hadn't filled out the paperwork yet.
No.
The law literally forbade them from ever becoming citizens no matter how long they lived here.
Precisely. It was a permanent legal brick wall. A Mexican national could, in theory, navigate the difficult naturalization process, though it was arduous and expensive. But an Asian immigrant could not. So the citizenship gate functioned differently for different groups, but the end result was identical. Total exclusion from the economic lifeline of the CCC.
Okay, but how does that impact the generational dynamics of these families? Because, okay, if the father is an immigrant and legally barred, but his 18-year-old son was born in California or Texas and is a citizen, the son is eligible.
Right, he is, and that completely upends the traditional family structure. Remember, the CCC was, at its core, a relief program designed to support families.
Right, they were sending money home.
Yes. The standard enrollee earned $30 a month, which was a very solid wage at the time. But the catch was that the government mandated 25 of those dollars be sent directly back home to a designated dependent.
Leaving the enrollee with, what, $5 a month?
$5 a month for personal expenses at the canteen, toothpaste, tobacco, that kind of thing.
So in these immigrant families where the parents were excluded by the citizenship requirement, the burden of financial survival fell completely on the shoulders of these U.S.-born teenage sons.
Exactly. You have 18 and 19-year-olds suddenly becoming the sole breadwinners. They're literally the only thing keeping their entire families from starvation or eviction.
That is a massive amount of pressure to place on a teenager.
It was. And while we really must acknowledge that this $25 a month was a godsend that kept families afloat, we also have to recognize the strict gatekeeping of the program.
Right.
The citizenship requirement is not just some minor piece of administrative trivia, it is the foundational filter. It decided who was even allowed to step into the camp and face the next, even more complex set of systemic barriers.
Which brings us to the actual paperwork once you made it inside.
Right.
Let's trace this journey. Say you are a young, U.S.-born Mexican-American man in New Mexico. You're a citizen. You survive the Hoover-era panic. You pass the citizenship test at the recruitment office, and you enroll. Now you encounter the CCC's bookkeeping system. And this is where the story shifts from exclusion to outright statistical erasure.
Yes, because the federal bureaucracy of the 1930s operated on a strict, completely unyielding racial binary. The primary enrollment document, Form 252, was designed in Washington, D.C.
By guys on the East Coast.
Exactly. And it reflected the racial preoccupations of the East Coast and the Jim Crow South. On that ledger, you were logged in one of two ways: white or colored.
That's it.
That was the entire spectrum of human identity recognized by the Civilian Conservation Corps.
So there was literally no box to check for a Hispanic enrollee. No category for a Mexican-American teen from El Paso or a Hispano ranch hand from the mountains of northern New Mexico.
None whatsoever. And this is the exact mechanism of statistical erasure we were talking about earlier. When you do not have a category on the official form, you literally cannot be counted.
You don't exist on paper.
Right. Because the CCC only tracked white and colored, there is no official, verifiable count of how many Hispanic or Mexican-American men served in the Corps. To this day, any number you see in a history book regarding Hispanic enrollment is a retroactive estimate.
Wait, really? We just don't know.
We don't know for sure. It's historians attempting to extrapolate data from, local district reports, camp newsletters, and anecdotal evidence.
That is staggering. I mean, the government kept receipts for every single shovel they purchased.
Yes, they did.
They tracked exactly how many miles of telephone wire they strung through the forests. But they simply chose not to design a system capable of counting the Hispanic men holding the wire.
It's a choice.
So if there was no federal directive on this, what did the local camp supervisors actually do when a Hispanic enrollee showed up and handed them their papers?
Well, they improvised. And they did so very unevenly, which further muddied the historical record. The federal vacuum forced local administrators to make arbitrary decisions.
Like what?
Well, in some districts, particularly where Hispanic populations were smaller, enrollees might just be checked off as white to make the paperwork easy. But in the Southwest, where the demographic reality was impossible to ignore, supervisors developed shadow classifications.
Like the W-2 classification. I really want to spend some time on this because when I saw this in the dossier, it felt so blatant. What exactly is a W-2?
So as historians have dug into localized district communications and, informal memos, basically the paperwork beneath the official Form 252, they've found instances where supervisors referred to Mexican-American enrollees as W-2, which stood for a second kind of white.
A second kind of white. Wow. So they are legally white enough to satisfy the citizenship and enrollment quotas from Washington, but locally, on the ground, they are designated as subordinate.
Precisely. It was an administrative tool to enforce a social hierarchy. The W-2 designation allowed local commanders to benefit from the labor of these men while actively denying them the privileges and promotions associated with actual whiteness within the camp structure.
This connects perfectly to a piece of historiography mentioned in our sources. There's a 2022 article from the journal Latino Studies that introduces the concept of Camp Chicano. Can you break down the methodology behind that? Because it seems vital to understanding how these young men actually experienced this erasure.
Yeah, that Latino Studies scholarship is a crucial intervention because it shifts the focus from what the government was doing to what the enrollees were actually experiencing.
Right, giving them their agency back.
Exactly. The authors analyze how the CCC camps operated as spaces where the outdoors itself became racialized. They argue that these camps weren't just neutral sites of labor, they were federal laboratories where young, U.S.-born Mexican Americans were forced to navigate a deeply complex emerging identity. And the authors use the term Chicano deliberately to describe this 1930s generation.
Right, because these young men didn't view themselves the way the government viewed them, and they didn't really view themselves the way their immigrant parents did either.
Exactly. I mean, they were citizens by birth, they spoke English, they listened to the radio, they considered themselves fully American. But the W-2 treatment in the CCC proved that federal and social institutions did not accept them as equal citizens.
They're stuck in the middle.
They were trapped in an administrative purgatory, legally entitled to be there, but socially and bureaucratically marginalized. So Camp Chicano refers to the specific, localized culture these men forged in response to that marginalization.
And we need to make it clear for you listening that this marginalization wasn't just a matter of hurt feelings or abstract bureaucratic insults. Being classified as a second kind of white had immediate punitive economic consequences. It dictated your daily life and your earning potential.
It absolutely did. It created an impenetrable glass ceiling. The CCC had a strict military-style hierarchy. You had basic enrollees making $30 a month, but you also had assistant leaders making $36 and leaders making $45.
Which is a significant bump in the 1930s.
Huge. And these promotions came with better quarters, less grueling manual labor, and authority over other men. But according to the surviving records and oral histories, Hispanic enrollees were almost universally barred from these leadership tracks.
So the looker commander looks at his roster, sees the W-2 next to a guy who is a phenomenal worker, and actively passes him over for a promotion in favor of a less experienced white enroll only.
Yes, frequently. And furthermore, Hispanic enrollees, often alongside Black enrollees, were disproportionately assigned to the most menial, degrading tasks around the camp.
Like what?
Latrine duty, kitchen scrubbing, basic maintenance. Yet, when it was time to do the massive headline-grabbing conservation work, they were the ones sent out into the heat.
They were doing the heavy lifting. They were out there swinging axes, doing heavy stone masonry, terracing mountainsides for erosion control.
Right.
Imagine the daily, grinding cognitive dissonance of that. You wake up in a barracks, you eat breakfast, and you go out to move boulders for 8 hours in the blistering sun. You are doing the exact same back-breaking physical labor as the white enrollee standing next to you. But you know that the invisible W-2 next to your name ensures he will get the promotion to assistant leader, and you will be scrubbing the pots that night.
It's incredibly demoralizing.
You are literally building the infrastructure of the nation, but the government's ledger ensures you remain a second-class laborer.
The paperwork dictated the reality of the dirt. Administrative classification is never just administrative. It's economic, and it is physical.
Let's move from the abstract to the specific. To truly grasp the friction of these policies, we need to leave the macro-level statistics and go to the ground level. The dossier provides a really rare primary account from a man named Manuel Fraijo at the Grand Canyon. And I know you want to contextualize the rarity of this source before we discuss his actual story.
I do, because it is essential that we do. For university students studying historical methodology, Manuel Fraijo's account is a masterclass in archival scarcity.
That's hard to find.
It's almost impossible. His story is preserved by the National Park Service, but it is one of the only accounts preserved by name that details the specific ethnic friction experienced by a Hispanic enrollee.
Wow, one of the only ones.
Yes. The archive is so thin that we have to treat his single narrative as a proxy for the experiences of thousands of undocumented men. Now, we can't assume every camp operated exactly like his, but his account exposes the machinery of prejudice that the official reports actively tried to hide.
So let's look at Fraijo's timeline. He's an enrollee of Hispanic heritage, initially assigned to Company 819. They're stationed on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, doing forestry and trail work. And almost immediately he hits a wall. Not with the labor, but with the camp leadership.
According to his preserved account, the sergeant in charge of Company 819 actively and continuously harassed the Hispanic men regarding their national heritage.
Just overt racism.
It wasn't subtle bias, it was overt daily hostility. The sergeant would lecture them, enforcing the idea that they were inferior and should consider themselves lucky that the federal government even allowed them to occupy space in his camp.
It's the W-2 mentality spoken out loud by the man controlling your daily life.
Exactly.
But Fraijo doesn't just put his head down, does he? He actively resists.
He does. He states clearly that he wanted nothing to do with this sergeant's abuse, and he exercises the very limited agency he has. He formally requests a transfer to another company. And this is where the historical narrative becomes truly fascinating. because he transfers down into Company 818.
And Company 818 is incredible. It is such an anomaly in the CCC system. First of all, the geography of where they were working is important. Company 819 is up on the rim, where the tourists are, where the command structure is easily visible. But Company 818 is sent to the absolute bottom of the Grand Canyon, down at Phantom Ranch, to build the Colorado River Trail.
And the working conditions down at Phantom Ranch were incredibly brutal. The heat could easily reach 115 degrees.
Unbelievable.
But everything, food, dynamite, tools, had to be packed down on mules. It was isolated, dangerous, exhausting, heavy construction along the river corridor. And here's the key. Company 818 was primarily a black company.
But the social dynamic at the bottom of the canyon was radically different than the hostility up on the rim.
It was a localized exception to the entire federal rulebook. Down at Phantom Ranch, completely isolated from the daily micromanagement of the regional commanders, Company 818 operated as a rare, functional, integrated workspace.
Wow.
You had Black enrollees, white enrollees, and Hispanic enrollees like Manuel Frejo all living in the same isolated camp, doing the same dangerous trail work side by side. The shared burden of surviving the canyon essentially superseded the racial binary of the ledger.
And we know this not just from written accounts, but because we actually have photographic evidence, which again is so rare. This brings in another key figure, John B. Scott.
Yes. John B. Scott's presence in the archive is just a brilliant counter-narrative. Scott was a black enrollee who joined Company 818 in June of 1935 as a 19-year-old. And because the work was so specialized and dangerous, Scott quickly became a seasoned veteran of the canyon.
He knew what he was doing.
He did. He was actually tasked with training new enrollees, regardless of their race, on how to survive the heat, handle the tools, and work safely on the cliff edges. He was a recognized authority figure on the ground.
And he had a camera.
Crucially, yes. Scott took many of the surviving photographs of Phantom Ranch during this period. And his photos document this integrated workforce.
It wasn't just a rumor.
No, we have the pictures. He captured men of different backgrounds resting together, working together, existing outside the rigid boxes of the Form 252. His camera provides absolute proof that when the federal bureaucracy wasn't looking, working-class men could and did form integrated cooperative units.
It's a glimpse of what the CCC could have been if Oscar Dupree's anti-discrimination clause had actually been enforced in spirit.
Exactly.
But that utopian microcosm at the bottom of the canyon was highly vulnerable, and it was about to be crushed by Washington, D.C.
Right. Localized integration cannot survive a hostile federal mandate. And in 1935, the national director of the CCC, Robert Fechner, issued a sweeping, devastating policy directive.
The segregation order. Now, I have to push back here, or at least ask for clarification. The CCC was administered on the ground by the U.S. Army, right?
Yeah.
And the Army in 1935 was already strictly officially segregated. Was Director Fechner instituting a brand new racist policy, or was he just forcing the CCC to fall in line with standard War Department protocols?
That is a vital historiographical question. So yes, the Army was indeed segregated, and early in the CCC, there were some mixed camps, but local Army commanders frequently pushed to separate them, citing quote-unquote morale issues among white enrollees.
Right.
But Fechner, however, was not military. He was a civilian labor leader appointed by FDR. Fechner made the conscious civilian executive decision to codify and rigidly enforce complete segregation across the entire program.
He made it official everywhere.
He ordered the complete segregation of colored and white enrollees, and he explicitly defended this policy by writing, and I quote, "Segregation is not discrimination."
Oh, wow. Which is straight out of the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal playbook.
Exactly.
It is pure bureaucratic doublespeak designed to bypass the anti-discrimination clause in the 1933 law.
It really is. He's arguing that as long as black camps receive the same caloric intake and the same canvas tents, it isn't discrimination. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Fechner's order doomed spaces like Company 818.
Because you can't have an integrated camp anymore.
Right. Once you mandate complete segregation, integrated camps have to be dismantled. It led to strict caps on black enrollment and the forced relocation of black companies away from communities that complained about their presence.
And how does this affect Manuel Frejo and the other Hispanic enrollees? I mean, if the new rule from Washington is that every single camp in America must be strictly white or colored, where does the W-2 enrollee go?
They're forced back into the margins. Fechner's binary mandate completely short-circuits in the Southwest. The policy forces local commanders to either shove Hispanic enrollees into white camps and enforce rigid internal segregation like the sergeant at Company 819 did, or quietly group them with black enrollees, which further complicated the local racial hierarchy.
The system just breaks down.
The rigid East Coast binary simply could not comprehend the demographic reality of the borderlands.
There's also a massive cultural context to this friction that we have to discuss. The CCC didn't just drop into an empty wilderness in the Southwest. They were dropping into a highly developed, ancient cultural landscape.
This is a critical point for understanding the local resentment toward the CCC. When the federal government established camps in places like northern New Mexico, they were entering territories where Hispano and indigenous communities had deeply ingrained centuries-old practices of land management.
These weren't untouched forests.
No, these families had been stewarding this specific terrain long before the United States even claimed it.
The dossier specifically highlights the acequia systems and communal grazing. Explain how those functioned before the CCC arrived.
Sure. So an acequia is a community-operated watercourse used for irrigation. In the arid Southwest, water is life, and the Hispano villages managed water collectively. There was a highly structured, democratic system for maintaining the ditches and distributing the water.
Everyone pitched in.
Exactly. Similarly, they utilized complex systems of communal grazing for their livestock and collective management of the woodlands for timber and firewood. It was a sophisticated generational relationship with the ecosystem based on shared survival, not federal ownership.
So picture this clash. You have these young Hispano men whose fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers managed this exact watershed through deep communal democratic traditions. Suddenly, the federal government arrives.
Right.
They claim the land as a national forest. They take these young men, put them in a military-style uniform, put them in a hierarchical camp run by an East Coast Army officer, and classify them as a second kind of white on a ledger.
Yeah.
And the CCC claims that they are there to conserve the landscape, but they are completely ignoring and overriding the people who've been conserving it for 300 years.
It is a profound tragedy of administrative arrogance. The federal bureaucracy viewed the land as a blank slate in need of improvement, and they viewed the local inhabitants as raw, unclassified labor. The CCC modernized the infrastructure, yes. But in doing so, it disrupted ancestral land practices and reclassified the sons of the region as subordinate laborers on their own ancestral soil. The friction wasn't just about race. It was a fundamental clash over who possessed the legitimate knowledge to manage the earth.
If the rigid racial binary of the East Coast caused that much administrative chaos in New Mexico and Arizona, what on earth happens when the CCC leaves the mainland entirely? Because this program didn't stop at the borders of the lower 48. We need to take a journey to the territorial camps.
And the territorial CCC programs are where the standard federal template utterly and completely collapses.
Because the demographics are completely different.
Completely. When you take an organization designed to manage mainland, predominantly white, single, urban young men, and you drop it onto agrarian islands with entirely different demographics, colonial histories, and economic realities, the bureaucracy has to bend or it breaks. Let's begin our journey in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico.
The CCC operated in Puerto Rico roughly from 1935 to 1941. And the very first thing that changes is the target demographic for recruitment. On the mainland, they wanted guys from cities like Chicago or New York who had never held an axe. But in Puerto Rico, they're recruiting the Jibaros.
Yes, the Jibaros were the rural agrarian heart of Puerto Rico. These were men who lived and worked in the interior mountains. They were former sugarcane workers, subsistence farmers, charcoal makers.
They already knew how to work the land.
Exactly. They were intimately familiar with hard manual labor and the local ecology. The CCC wasn't teaching them how to use a machete. It was just finally paying them to use it.
But the economic reality of the Jibaro completely broke the CCC's enrollment rules, didn't it?
It forced a massive federal concession. On the mainland, the rule was ironclad. Enrollees had to be young, unmarried men, typically between 17 and 23. But in Puerto Rico, the Great Depression had decimated the agricultural economy so thoroughly that entire multi-generational families were facing starvation. The standard mainland template simply did not match the crisis. So, the CCC bent the rules. They allowed much older men to enroll. The age limit was pushed up to 45 years old.
That is a staggering shift in camp culture.
Yeah.
You go from a barracks full of restless 19-year-olds to a camp that includes middle-aged men with deep life experience.
And even more critically, the CCC allowed married men to enroll in Puerto Rico.
Wait, really?
Yes. This was a tacit admission by Washington that their one-size-fits-all policy was a failure outside the mainland. They desperately needed the labor to build infrastructure, and the island desperately needed the wage relief, so they quietly altered the bureaucracy to fit the reality on the ground.
And the work they accomplish is legendary. If you visit Puerto Rico today, their legacy is carved into the mountains.
Primarily in the Luquillo Forest, which we now know as El Yunque National
Oh,
Forest.
beautiful area.
Stunning. And the Jibaros undertook massive reforestation projects there on steep, treacherous slopes. They carved out the essential trail systems through the dense rainforest canopy, and they constructed those magnificent, enduring stone observation towers, like the Yokahu Tower, that are still iconic today. They physically engineered the modern accessibility of El Yunque.
So if Puerto Rico bent the rules regarding age and marriage, what happens when we travel across the globe to the Pacific? Let's talk about the territory of Hawaii.
Okay. The Hawaiian CCC camps started slightly earlier in 1934 and ran into the wartime mobilization in 1942. They established camps across the archipelago, Oahu, Maui, Kauai, Molokai, and the Big Island of Hawaii. And the sheer scale of the demographic footprint is what historians find most remarkable.
Our sources indicate that by some estimates, 8 to 10% of the entire territory's young men pass through the CCC. 8 to 10%.
It's massive. It means the CCC wasn't a fringe program in Hawaii. It was a central pillar of a generation's coming-of-age experience. Almost every community, every extended family on the islands had a direct connection to a camp. But the demographics inside those camps were unlike anything Robert Fechner was managing back in Washington.
Because Hawaii had a deeply established plantation economy that had been importing and mixing global labor for decades.
Exactly. The Big Five sugar and pineapple corporations had intentionally brought in diverse waves of immigrant labor to work the fields. So when the CCC opened its doors to the local boys, it absorbed that incredible diversity.
Tell me about the camps at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park.
Right, look at the camp station there. In the Puna and Kau districts, you had enrollees of native Hawaiian descent living and working side by side with men of Japanese, Filipino, Portuguese, Chinese, Korean, and Puerto Rican ancestry.
Just picture the mess hall in one of those camps. Fechner is in D.C. obsessing over separating white and colored enrollees. And meanwhile, in Hawaii, you have this vibrant polyglot melting pot. You have different languages, different culinary traditions, different religions, all operating under the uniform of the federal government. Did the administration even try to enforce the binary ledger there?
They couldn't. I mean, the binary completely disintegrated. In the territories, because there was no dominant white majority to serve as the baseline, the local men of color were the core.
So what did the paperwork look like?
The bureaucracy essentially threw up its hands. They aggregated them into bulk territorial numbers. The federal government didn't know how to classify a Portuguese Hawaiian enrollee working next to a native Hawaiian enrollee, so they just labeled them all territorial and focused on the output.
And the output was monumental. The ecological impact is almost hard to comprehend. The dossier mentions the work on Kauai specifically.
On the island of Kauai alone, the CCC planted over 1 million trees.
1 million trees. That is terraforming. That alters the watershed, the soil retention, and the microclimate of an island for generations. But here's the through line that connects the Jibaro in El Yunque to the local boy in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Despite being thousands of miles away from the mainland, despite the administrative confusion over how to classify them, the core economic engine of the New Deal bargain held firm.
It did. If we connect this all back to the initial mission of the CCC, the relief mechanism functioned exactly as intended. These young men in Hawaii and Puerto Rico were paid the standard $30 a month, and the vast majority of that federal money was routed directly back to their families.
The ultimate goal was still survival.
Yes. The overarching goal of preventing starvation and injecting cash into local economies superseded the federal government's inability to neatly categorize the workers.
So we've seen the bureaucracy bend in Puerto Rico and disintegrate into a melting pot in Hawaii. But as we continue our territorial journey, we reach the extreme edges of the map where the government's record-keeping goes from fuzzy to almost entirely bare. Let's look at Alaska.
Okay, the territory of Alaska presents a uniquely complex administrative puzzle that historians are literally still untangling. The stated aim from Washington was that roughly half of all new enrollees in the expanded Alaskan program were to be Native Alaskans.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a straightforward metric. They wanted 50% Native enrollment. But how did that actually play out in the paperwork?
It resulted in a massive jurisdictional turf war. because simultaneously there was the CCC Indian Division, which operated nationwide,
Hmm.
and the Indian Division was administered not by the War Department, but primarily through the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Oh, different bosses.
Completely different bosses. It had different funding, different project goals, and it allowed men to stay on their own reservations rather than moving to military camps.
So in Alaska, you have the standard territorial CCC scene running projects, and you have the CCC Indian Division running projects in the exact same massive, difficult geography.
And the administrative lines between the two blurred constantly. I mean, this is a vital lesson for anyone studying the reality of archives. Top-down bureaucratic classifications break down completely when they hit the messy reality of the ground.
How messy did it get?
Well, an enrollee of Alaska Native descent might be doing conservation work that technically falls under the jurisdiction of the territorial camp while his payroll is being processed through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Or local administrators might simply merge the rosters without distinction just to save time.
So when a historian today looks at an Alaskan CCC ledger, it isn't a clean data set.
Not at all.
It's a disorganized stack of contradicting memos. It requires immense, painstaking diligence to figure out who was answering to whom and under what set of rules they were laboring.
It's the difference between reading history and doing history. Doing history requires untangling the knots the bureaucracy left behind.
Which brings us to our final territorial stop. From the freezing, administratively tangled north, we travel down to the Caribbean to the U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. Now, the U.S. had only purchased these islands from Denmark in 1917, so this was a very new colonial territory. We know the CCC operated there, and we know they enrolled Afro-Caribbean men to do conservation work. But our dossier includes a very specific mandate for us regarding this section.
It does. The steering prompt for this dossier demands that we, quote, be honest about the gaps in the record. And the historical reality is that when it comes to the Virgin Islands, this is the absolute thinnest record of the 4 territories we have discussed.
How thin are we talking?
The archival documentation is sparse. It's scattered across different colonial offices, and in many places, it is simply non-existent.
We don't have a Manuel Frejo account. We don't have John B. Scott's photographs.
No.
Why is the record so thin? Is it because of hurricane destruction of physical archives, or is it just bureaucratic apathy?
It is likely a combination of both. But primarily, it reflects the marginal status of the Virgin Islands in the minds of Washington administrators at the time. The CCC was a mainland-focused agency. The territories were an afterthought, and the Virgin Islands were an afterthought among the territories.
They just didn't care enough to write it down.
The federal government simply did not expend the resources to thoroughly document the daily lives, the specific cultural contributions, or the individual struggles of the Afro-Caribbean enrollees the way they documented the white camps in New York or Pennsylvania.
And I want to pause here because I think acknowledging this is such a profound historical insight for you listening. Naming the lack of documentation, physically pointing at the empty shelf in the archive. That is an active part of historical research. We cannot just skip over the Virgin Islands because the government didn't bother to keep good records.
We must state their presence plainly. Afro-Caribbean men enrolled in the Civilian Conservation Corps in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They cleared the brush, they built the infrastructure, they earned the wages, they were an integral part of this massive federal machine.
They were there.
They were there, and the fact that the archives fail to detail their existence is a historical fact in itself. The silence of the archive is a type of evidence. It is evidence of who the institution valued enough to remember.
The silence is the evidence. Wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started at the structural gate of the citizenship requirement, navigated the absurdities and economic punishments of the W-2 classification, stood at the bottom of the Grand Canyon with Manuel Frejo, and traced the bending and breaking of the rules across Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, and the Virgin Islands.
We've spent the deep dive tracking the men the paperwork refused to count.
So what does this all mean? How do we synthesize this? Because I think it's very easy to look at the W-2 classification or Fechner's segregation order or the archival silence of the Virgin Islands and just feel profound anger at the bureaucracy. To write the CCC off as a fundamentally prejudiced institution. But history doesn't allow us to be that simplistic, does it?
No, it does not. The truth requires us to hold conflicting realities in tension. Let's look at the pattern of the archive. The men who are the absolute hardest to recover today, the ones whose stories historians have to fight tooth and nail to find, are exactly the men the CCC's paperwork couldn't easily categorize.
Right.
Black enrollment, as fraught, capped, and brutally discriminated against as it was by Fechner's orders, was at least tracked because the ledger possessed a colored box. Native American enrollment on the mainland had an entire separate division, the Indian Division, with its own specific, though often paternalistic and flawed, record-keeping.
But the Hispanic men had no box at all. They were statistically vanished, folded into white or colored based on the whim of a local supervisor, and held beneath a glass ceiling of promotion. And the territorial men were stripped of their specific cultural identities, the Jibaro, the Hawaiian local boy, the Afro-Caribbean islander, and aggregated into generic, bulk colonial numbers.
And yet, this brings us back to the core thesis of the era. We must acknowledge that the Civilian Conservation Corps was, without a doubt, one of the most wildly popular and overwhelmingly beneficial government programs in American history.
It saved lives.
It took millions of desperate, starving young men out of breadlines. It gave them a living wage, medical care, and job skills. It quite literally kept a generation of families from going under during the Great Depression. And it built lasting, magnificent public works of the parks, trails, and forests that define the American relationship with the outdoors nearly a century later.
It was an engine of survival and conservation.
It was. But at its margins, where the administrative lines blurred, it was quietly and systematically unjust. It capped Black enrollment. It segregated camps. It vanished Hispanic men into a binary that didn't fit them. It ignored ancestral land practices in the Southwest. It homogenized the vibrant cultures of the territories.
Both of those massive statements are true at the exact same time. This is not a comic book story of heroes and villains. It is the story of a massive, heavily armed government machine doing incredible life-saving good while simultaneously operating with severe structural blinders on. A historical program can be genuinely beneficial, and it can be structurally discriminatory simultaneously.
The fact that we cannot give you a precise count of the Hispanic men who swung axes in the Southwest is the evidence of that structural discrimination.
The erasure itself is the legacy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our job is to learn how to hold the physical triumph of the infrastructure in one hand and the administrative failure of the ledger in the other.
I think that is the perfect synthesis for this deep dive. We started this conversation by talking about how we desperately want the archive to be a clean mirror. We want to see the exact numbers clearly printed on the page. But we have seen today that the archive is a curated, constructed space built by administrators who brought all their biases, their East Coast blind spots, and their rigid rules about who mattered enough to be counted properly.
The muddy waters of administrative history require us to look closer. We have to read between the lines, hunt for the W-2 memos, look at John B. Scott's photographs, and actively listen for the voices that were intentionally omitted from the final, polished federal reports.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you, our listener, with today. Something to mull over the next time you find yourself out exploring the country. When you visit a national park or a state forest today, when you walk on a beautifully graded switchback trail, or when you take shelter in a rustic, perfectly fitted stone pavilion, you are interacting with a curated landscape. It feels wild and pristine, but it was built. It was engineered. If the federal government was able to physically construct these beautiful, enduring natural spaces using the heavy labor of marginalized men, while simultaneously erasing their identities from the historical ledger, what other pristine American institutions were built on the invisible labor of people who were legally boxed out of the narrative? The next time you hike a CCC trail, look down at the dirt. Ask yourself, whose ghosts are you walking on?